The lunch rush at Calder's table hit like it always did on a Tuesday, fast, loud, and short-staffed. Maren had been running food and drinks for 3 hours straight, her feet aching inside shoes that had seen better years, when she noticed the schedule taped behind the host stand was wrong. 2 servers short. No one had caught it until customers were already stacking up at the door. She walked over to Gavin, who was leaning against the prep counter, scrolling through his phone like the dining room wasn't filling up behind him. "Hey, I think there's a mistake on today's schedule," she said quietly, keeping her voice low so the customers near the host stand wouldn't hear. "We're missing 2 people for the lunch shift." Gavin didn't even look up right away. When he did, his expression had that familiar tightness, the one he got whenever someone questioned him in front of other people. "The schedule's fine," he said. "Maybe you just need to move faster." "I'm not trying to start anything, I just think—" "You think a lot for someone who takes the bus to work." He said it loud enough that the couple waiting by the door turned their heads. A few regulars at the counter went quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a room feel smaller. "People who ride the bus should be grateful just to have a job, don't you think? Maybe focus on that instead of telling me how to run my restaurant." The words landed exactly where he wanted them to. Maren felt her face go warm, that particular sting of being humiliated in front of strangers who had no idea who she actually was. She could have said something back. She had plenty she could have said. Instead, she took a slow breath, smoothed the front of her apron, and turned to the customers nearby. "I'm so sorry for the wait, everyone. We're a little behind today, but I promise your food is coming right up." She didn't look at Gavin again. She picked up 2 plates from the pass and kept moving, because that was what she always did. Calm. Steady. Like his words hadn't found their mark at all, even though they had. It wasn't until her short break 20 minutes later, hiding in the narrow hallway by the walk-in cooler, that her hands finally trembled enough for her to notice. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to her husband. "Work is a mess today. I don't think I'm going to make our anniversary lunch. I'm so sorry. I'll explain tonight." She hit send before she could second-guess it, then wiped under her eyes with the back of her wrist and walked back out to the floor like nothing had happened. Across the city, on the 32nd floor of a glass building overlooking the river, Damon Reyes read the message in the middle of closing out a meeting that had taken him 4 months to set up. He didn't react. Not outwardly. The men across the table kept talking about freight contracts and timelines, and Damon nodded in the right places, signed where he needed to sign, and shook the hands that needed shaking. But part of his mind had already left the room. 2 years. 2 years of marriage, and in all that time, his wife had never once asked him to fix anything for her. Not when her car broke down and she took the bus for 3 weeks instead of letting him buy her a new one. Not when her landlord raised her rent without warning. Not even now, when some manager apparently felt comfortable embarrassing her in front of a packed restaurant. She didn't know he knew about Gavin. She'd mentioned him before, in passing, the way people mention an annoying co-worker. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed for intervention. Maren never asked for help. She solved her own problems, or she carried them quietly until they passed. It was one of the first things Damon had loved about her, and it was also the thing that worried him most. She would absorb anything before she'd ask anyone to stand up for her. He thought about calling her back immediately and decided against it. A phone call would turn into reassurances, and reassurances would turn into her insisting she was fine, and he'd hang up no closer to understanding what was actually happening at that restaurant. Instead, he made a decision. He'd go see for himself. Not as the man whose name made grown executives sit up straighter in conference rooms, just as her husband, showing up the way any husband might on an anniversary. Quietly, without warning, maybe with flowers, maybe a little late. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The meeting still had 20 minutes left. He sat back down, let the conversation about freight contracts continue, and answered questions when asked. But underneath the calm exterior, something had shifted. Whatever was happening to Maren at that restaurant, it was about to collide with a part of his life she'd spent 2 years keeping carefully separate from her own. And neither of them had any idea how soon that collision would come. Marin's apartment sat on the third floor of an old brick building in Pilsen, the kind of place with creaky radiators and a window unit that rattled all summer. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Well, theirs, even if almost nobody knew that. She got home a little after 11 that night, peeled off her shoes by the door, and found Damon already there, sitting at the small kitchen table with 2 plates of reheated pasta and a bottle of wine he'd clearly picked up on the way over. He hadn't mentioned her text. He just stood up when she walked in, wrapped his arms around her, and let her exhale into his shoulder for a long moment before either of them said a word. "I'm sorry about today," she finally said, pulling back. "I know it was our anniversary. I really thought I could make it work." "You don't have to apologize for your job being chaotic," he said, guiding her to sit. "Tell me what happened." She told him most of it, the schedule mix-up, the rush, leaving out the comment about the bus because some part of her still felt embarrassed by it, even though none of it was her fault. Damon listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly at certain parts, though he kept his voice even. "You know I could. Don't," she said, gently but firmly, the way she always did when this conversation came up. "We agreed. This is my life, my job. I want to earn what I have because of what I do, not because of who I'm married to." It was an old conversation between them, one that had started 2 years ago, right after their small courthouse wedding with 2 witnesses and no announcement to anyone outside their closest circle. Damon Reyes wasn't the kind of man whose name disappeared into a crowd. People in certain rooms straightened up when he walked in. People in other rooms Marin never asked questions about, went quiet entirely. He built a life out of influence, the kind that came with security details and quiet respect, and the occasional uneasy glance from strangers who recognized him. Marin had asked him, early on, never to let that world touch hers. "I don't want people deciding I'm worth something because of you," she'd told him back then. "I want my own friendships, my own promotions. If I ever get respected somewhere, I want to know it's because I earned it." He'd agreed without much hesitation. It made sense to him in a way it might not have made sense to other men in his position. Damon had grown up watching people get treated differently depending on whose son or wife or cousin they were, and he'd hated it even before he understood why. Letting Marin build something entirely her own felt less like a sacrifice and more like protecting the one part of his life that had nothing to do with power. Still, sitting across from her tonight, watching her shoulders slowly unclench as the wine warmed her, he couldn't pretend it didn't bother him. "It gets harder," he admitted. "Watching someone treat you like that and not being able to do anything." "You're doing something," Marin said. "You're listening. That's enough." He wasn't sure it was, but he let it go, because pushing wouldn't change her mind, and he respected her too much to try. 3 miles away, at Calder's table, Gavin had already moved on from the afternoon's incident entirely. To him, it had been nothing, just another moment of putting an employee back in her place. He didn't think about Marin much outside of shifts. As far as he was concerned, she was reliable enough, polite enough, and unremarkable enough to not be worth more than a passing thought. He assumed, the way people sometimes assume things about co-workers they've never bothered asking about, that her life outside the restaurant looked roughly like her life inside it. Small apartment, public transit, no family worth mentioning, since she never talked about one. To Gavin, Marin existed in a fairly narrow box. Competent waitress, quiet, easy to overlook, easy to correct in front of customers when the mood struck him. He had no interest in learning otherwise. People like Gavin rarely did. It was simpler to assume someone's whole story fit inside the version you'd already decided on, especially if that version let you feel a little bigger by comparison. What he didn't know, what he had no reason to know, was that the same modest woman he'd humiliated in front of a packed restaurant went home most nights to a man who could end his career with a single phone call and had no interest whatsoever in doing it, because she'd never once asked him to. 2 completely different worlds were running parallel to each other, separated by nothing more than a few city blocks and one woman's quiet decision to keep them that way. It wouldn't stay that way much longer. The days after the schedule incident moved in their usual rhythm at Calder's table, but Noah found himself paying closer attention to Maren than he had before. Noah had worked there almost as long as Gavin had managed the place, long enough to recognize patterns most people missed. He'd watched plenty of servers come and go, some bitter, some burned out, most just putting in their hours and counting down to the next paycheck. Maren was different, though he couldn't always put his finger on why until he started noticing the small things. On Wednesday, one of the newer servers, a young guy named Patrick, came in looking pale and distracted. His daughter had spiked a fever overnight, and his wife couldn't get off work to take her to the doctor. He'd come in anyway because he was scared of what Gavin would say if he called out again so soon after starting. Maren overheard him explaining it to another co-worker in the back, and without making a scene about it, she pulled Patrick aside. "Go," she said. "I'll cover your tables. Just text me what section you had and I'll handle it." "You sure? That's basically doubling your shift." "I'm sure. Family comes first. Go take care of her." Patrick left within 10 minutes, visibly relieved, and Maren spent the rest of her shift moving twice as fast, smiling at customers who had no idea she was covering for someone else entirely. She never mentioned it to Gavin. She didn't need credit for it. Noah noticed. A few days later, an elderly customer named Mrs. Holloway, a regular who came in most Thursdays for the soup special, left her wallet behind on the table after lunch. Maren found it while bussing, and instead of turning it over to the lost and found drawer behind the host stand, where things sometimes sat for weeks, she remembered the woman mentioning she lived nearby on Halstead. After her shift ended, tired as she was, Maren walked 4 blocks out of her way to return it personally. Mrs. Holloway nearly cried at the door. "You didn't have to do that, dear." "I know," Maren said. "I wanted to make sure you had it before the weekend." She never told anyone at the restaurant about that either. Noah only found out because Mrs. Holloway mentioned it to him the following Thursday, gushing about the sweet waitress who'd gone out of her way for an old woman she barely knew. That same week, on her one evening off, Maren volunteered at a community food drive a few blocks from her apartment, packing boxes of canned goods and produce for families across the neighborhood. She'd been doing it for over a year, quietly, never posting about it anywhere, never mentioning it at work. She liked the rhythm of it, the assembly line of volunteers, the quiet satisfaction of watching a truck pull away loaded with boxes that would feed people who needed them. What she didn't know was that the funding behind that particular food drive, along with 2 others in the neighborhood, came from an anonymous donor who'd been quietly supporting local charities for years. Damon never attached his name to any of it. He'd learned early in his career that money given for recognition rarely did as much good as money given quietly, and besides, he had no interest in his name being tied to headlines of any kind. He preferred the donations stay invisible, the way most of his better instincts did. If he'd known his wife was packing boxes that very week at the food pantry his foundation funded, he might have found it almost funny. 2 people moving through the same corners of the city, doing good in their own separate ways, neither aware how closely their paths were brushing against each other. Noah didn't know any of that backstory, of course. All he knew was what he saw with his own eyes, day after day. Maren covering shifts without complaint. Maren remembering customers' names and orders without needing reminders. Maren staying calm under pressure that would have cracked most people, and somehow still finding energy to help strangers after her shift ended. It struck him as strange, the gap between how she was treated inside those restaurant walls and how she clearly was everywhere else. Outside, she earned genuine respect, from co-workers like Patrick, from customers like Mrs. Holloway, from people at the food pantry who'd grown to count on her showing up every week. Inside the restaurant, under Gavin's management, she remained an easy target, someone whose competence got overlooked and whose dignity got tested in front of an audience whenever Gavin felt the need to remind everyone who was in charge. Noah started keeping a mental note of these moments, not for any particular reason at first, just because they didn't sit right with him. Something about the disconnect bothered him more each time he noticed it. Neither Maren nor Damon realized their quiet, separate acts of kindness were slowly building towards something neither of them could have predicted yet. Two parallel lives, still careful, still hidden from each other's professional worlds, but inching her closer to the moment when those worlds would finally meet in front of everyone. Damon woke up early on Saturday with one plan in mind: make up for the anniversary lunch they'd missed, even if it was 6 days late. He told his security team to wait outside, parked a block from Calder's table, and walked the rest of the way alone. No suit jacket, no driver, nothing that would draw attention. He wore a plain gray sweater and jeans, picked up a bunch of white tulips from a corner flower stand, because he remembered Maren mentioning once that tulips reminded her of her grandmother's garden, and walked through the restaurant's front door just before noon. The lunch crowd hadn't picked up yet. A few tables were occupied, soft conversation filling the room, the smell of garlic and fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Damon scanned the room for Maren and didn't see her right away, so he stood near the host stand, flowers in hand, waiting. Gavin spotted him first. To Gavin, the man standing by the entrance looked like nothing special. Average height, plain clothes, holding a bundle of flowers like he was nervous about something. Probably some guy here to apologize to his girlfriend, Gavin figured, or a regular waiting on a reservation that didn't exist yet. "You can wait by the door," Gavin said, barely glancing up from the receipts he was sorting. "We'll get you seated when a table opens." Damon nodded politely and didn't argue. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here for one person, and he was content to wait as long as it took to see her. A few minutes later, Maren came out from the back, carrying a tray of drinks for table 6. She caught sight of him near the entrance and stopped mid-step, the tray nearly tilting in her hands before she caught herself. Her face broke into the kind of smile she rarely let show at work. Wide, unguarded, completely real. "Damon," she said under her breath, setting the tray down on the nearest empty table so she could walk over to him. "Happy late anniversary," he said, holding out the tulips. "I figured if you couldn't make it to lunch, I'd bring lunch to you instead." She laughed, taking the flowers, her eyes a little glassy. "You didn't have to do this. I have a whole shift left." "I know. I'm not staying long. I just wanted to see you." For a moment, standing there in the middle of the restaurant, it was just the two of them, the noise of the lunch rush fading into the background. It was the kind of moment Maren had wanted all week and thought she wouldn't get. Then Gavin's voice cut through it. "Excuse me," he said, walking over with the clipped tone he used whenever he felt something was happening that he hadn't approved of. "I understand this is sweet, but we do have customers waiting, and employees aren't supposed to be socializing with guests during their shift." Maren's smile faltered slightly. "He's not just a guest, Gavin, he's—" "It doesn't matter who he is," Gavin interrupted, not even bothering to look at Damon directly. "If every server stopped to chat with whoever walked in, we'd never get anything done. I need you back on the floor." The warmth in the room cooled instantly. A couple of nearby customers glanced over, sensing the shift in tone. Maren's jaw tightened, that same familiar sting from earlier in the week threatening to surface again, except this time it wasn't just about her. It was about Damon standing there, dismissed without a second thought, treated like an inconvenience instead of a person. Damon, for his part, didn't react the way Gavin probably expected. He didn't raise his voice or pull rank. He simply held the moment, calm and unreadable, watching the way Gavin spoke to his wife with the same dismissiveness he probably used on every server who'd ever questioned him. "I'll only take a minute of her time," Damon said evenly. "I won't keep her from her tables." "That's not really how it works here," Gavin said, his tone sharpening, clearly uncomfortable with being challenged in front of customers, even mildly. "If you'd like to be seated, I can have someone help you. Otherwise, I need her back to work." Maren opened her mouth to defend the moment, to say something, anything, but Damon gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent signal that said, "Not yet, not like this." "Of course," Damon said instead, stepping back slightly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Gavin gave a satisfied nod, the kind of nod people give when they think they've successfully re-established control, and walked off toward the kitchen without another word. Marin turned to Damon, embarrassment and frustration flickering across her face. "I'm so sorry. He's like this with everyone." "Don't apologize," Damon said quietly, setting the tulips down on the host stand for her to grab later. "I'm not going anywhere yet." The air in the restaurant had shifted, tension humming just beneath the surface, and neither Gavin nor anyone else in the room had any idea how close they were to finding out exactly who he'd just spoken to like that. Marin went back to her tables, but the easy rhythm she usually carried through a shift had cracked. She kept glancing toward the host stand, where Damon had stepped aside to let her work, the tulips sitting untouched in their paper wrap. He hadn't left. He'd simply moved to a quiet corner near the window, content to wait, watching her move through the dining room with the same steady patience he brought to everything. Gavin, meanwhile, couldn't quite let it go. Something about the stranger lingering by the window irritated him, the same way it irritated him whenever he felt like he wasn't fully in control of his own restaurant. He made a point of walking past Damon twice, each time with a pointed look that suggested he should either order something or leave. The third time, he stopped. "Look, if you're waiting for a table, I can seat you now," Gavin said, arms crossed. "But if you're just here to keep distracting my staff, I'd appreciate it if you waited outside." A few nearby customers glanced up again, drawn by the edge in his voice. Marin, refilling water glasses 2 tables away, heard it too, and felt her stomach tighten. Gavin pressed further, apparently deciding to make a point of it. He glanced toward Marin, then back at Damon, something condescending creeping into his expression. "Is he another one of your struggling friends from the neighborhood? Because we really can't have people parked in here who aren't ordering." The comment landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. A couple of customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Marin set down the water pitcher slowly, her hands steady despite the heat rising in her chest. She walked over, stood beside Damon, and looked Gavin directly in the eye. "Actually," she said, her voice calm but clear enough to carry across the now quiet dining room, "he's my husband." For a moment, nobody moved. The clatter of silverware from the kitchen seemed to pause along with everything else. Gavin blinked, his mouth opening slightly before closing again, clearly trying to process what he'd just heard. "Your husband," he repeated, like the words didn't fit together correctly in his head. "Yes," Marin said simply. Gavin let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind people give when they think someone is joking and are waiting for the punchline. He looked Damon over again. Plain sweater, flowers sitting on the host stand, nothing about his appearance suggesting wealth or influence. "Right. Okay." It was at that exact moment that the front door opened and 2 men in dark coats stepped inside, scanning the room with quiet efficiency before one of them spoke quietly into a small earpiece. They'd been waiting outside as instructed, but Damon's unusually long visit had triggered the kind of concern that came with his line of work. They weren't there to cause a scene, they were simply checking in, but their presence did something the conversation alone hadn't. A man near the back, a regular who came in for business lunches twice a week, set down his fork and stared, recognition slowly dawning on his face. He leaned toward his colleague and said something under his breath, his eyes wide. Within seconds, 2 more tables had noticed, hushed whispers spreading like a current through the dining room. "That's Damon Reyes," someone murmured, just loud enough for nearby tables to catch. The name moved through the restaurant the way names like that always do, quietly at first, then unmistakably. Gavin's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to dread as he registered the reaction rippling around him. He looked at Damon again, this time really looked, and the pieces started falling into place in a way that made his stomach drop. This wasn't some ordinary man who'd wandered in with flowers. This was someone whose name alone made grown businessmen lower their voices, whose presence in a room changed the energy of it entirely. and Gavin had just spent the last 10 minutes talking down to him like he was nobody worth acknowledging. Gavin started, then stopped, clearly unable to find words that would undo what had already happened. His eyes flicked to Marin, the realization hitting even harder. The waitress he'd humiliated all week, the one he'd mocked for riding the bus and assumed had nothing and no one, was married to one of the most quietly influential men in the city. Damon raised a hand toward his security team, a small gesture that told them everything was fine, no need to intervene. They nodded and stepped back near the entrance, giving the room space. "I didn't come here to make a scene," Damon said, his voice even, almost gentle, though there was nothing soft about the weight it carried. "I came here because it's my anniversary, and I wanted to see my wife." Gavin's mouth opened again, but nothing useful came out. The confidence that had carried him through every interaction that week, every sharp comment and dismissive glance, had evaporated entirely. He stood there in the middle of his own restaurant, surrounded by customers who'd witnessed the entire exchange, fully aware that he'd misjudged not just a stranger, but the very employee he'd spent days underestimating. Marin didn't gloat. She didn't say another word to Gavin at all. She simply turned back to Damon, picked up the tulips from the host stand, and let the quiet truth of the moment settle over the room without needing to add anything more to it. Word of what happened at Calder's table reached the owner before the dinner shift even started. Celeste Whitaker had built the restaurant from a single dining room into one of the more respected spots downtown over the past 15 years, though these days she stayed mostly hands-off, trusting Gavin to run daily operations while she focused on the business side. She got the call from one of her longtime regulars, the businessman who'd recognized Damon, and within the hour, she was walking through the front doors herself, something she rarely did outside of scheduled visits. She found Gavin in the back office, sitting at the desk with his head in his hands, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days, despite it being barely 2 in the afternoon. "Tell me what happened," Celeste said, closing the door behind her. Gavin gave her a version of the story that left out most of the sharper details. How he'd spoken to the stranger by the door, how he'd made the comment about struggling friends, how the whole dining room had gone quiet when Marin said the word husband. Celeste listened without interrupting, but her expression grew more troubled the longer he talked. "And the customer, Mr. Reyes, is he upset? Is he planning to do something about this?" "I don't know," Gavin admitted. "He didn't seem angry. He just left with his wife after things calmed down." Celeste exhaled slowly and picked up her phone. She didn't have Damon's personal number, but it didn't take long to find a contact through the businessman who'd called her in the first place. To her surprise, Damon agreed to meet her that evening, not at some imposing office downtown, but at the restaurant itself, after closing, when the dining room had emptied out. He arrived without his security team this time, just him, sitting across from Celeste at a small table near the back. "I want to be clear about something," Damon said before she could even start the conversation she'd been rehearsing in her head all afternoon. "I'm not here because I want anyone fired. I'm not interested in revenge, and I don't want this turning into some kind of public spectacle that hurts your business." Celeste studied him for a moment, slightly thrown by the response. She'd expected something closer to a threat, or at the very least a demand. "Then what are you here for?" "I'm here because my wife works here, and she deserves to be treated with basic respect, the same as anyone else on your staff. That's all I want. Not because of who I am, because it's the right way to treat people." It wasn't the answer Celeste had braced for, and something about its simplicity made her trust him more than any threat could have. She nodded slowly, turning the conversation over in her mind. "I'll be honest with you," she said. "I haven't been as present here as I should have been. I trusted Gavin to run things fairly, and clearly that trust wasn't entirely earned." Over the next 2 days, Celeste did something she should have done long before any of this happened. She pulled the employee schedules going back 6 months, cross-referencing shift assignments with complaints she'd received but never fully investigated. She reviewed customer feedback cards, the ones that usually got skimmed and tossed. She sat down privately with several staff members, asking pointed questions about how things really operated under Gavin's management. What she found wasn't a single dramatic failure, but a pattern, small inconsistencies that added up over time. Talented servers who'd quietly put in notice over the past year, several of them mentioning vague reasons that, in hindsight, all pointed toward the same underlying issue. Shift assignments that consistently disadvantaged certain employees while protecting others. A handful of comments in old feedback cards about a manager who could be sharp-tongued with staff in front of customers. Celeste hadn't ignored these signs entirely, but she also hadn't connected them the way she should have. Running a successful restaurant had kept her focused on numbers, on growth, on the parts of the business that showed up clearly on a balance sheet. The day-to-day treatment of her staff had become someone else's responsibility, and she was only now realizing how much that delegation had cost people like Maren. She didn't rush to any decisions. She wanted the review to be fair, built on documented behavior rather than a single embarrassing incident, even one as public as what had happened with Damon. Firing Gavin out of panic just to smooth things over with an influential customer wouldn't actually fix anything. She owed her staff something more thorough than that. By the end of the second day, she had a much clearer picture of what had been happening inside her restaurant, and for the first time in a long while, she felt genuinely unsettled by what she'd allowed to continue under her own roof. News traveled fast in the restaurant industry, faster than Maren expected. By Monday, 2 separate calls had come in for her, both from hospitality groups she'd heard of, but never imagined would reach out directly. The first was from a boutique hotel chain downtown, the kind with a rooftop restaurant that regularly got written up in food magazines. The second came from a growing chain of upscale bistros expanding into the Chicago market. Both mentioned the same thing. Customers who'd eaten at Calder's table had specifically recommended her, praising her professionalism, her calm under pressure, the way she handled even difficult situations with grace. Maren sat on her couch that evening, phone in hand, staring at the 2 voicemails she'd saved, without quite knowing what to do with them. "This is good news," Damon said, settling beside her with 2 mugs of tea. "Why do you look like it's bad news?" "I don't know. It feels strange. A week ago I was getting yelled at over a scheduling mistake, and now people are offering me jobs because of how I handled it." "People noticed how you carried yourself," Damon said. "That's not strange. That's earned." She turned the phone over in her hands, weighing it. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to walk away from Calder's table and everything Gavin had put her through over the past months, but another part of her hesitated, unsure if leaving now would feel like running rather than choosing. What if I just took the better-paying one? The bistro group offered almost $10 more an hour than I'm making now. Damon shook his head slightly. "Don't choose based on the number. Choose based on where you'll actually be happy. You've got options now. Use them to pick the place that fits you, not just the one that pays the most." It was advice she hadn't expected to need, but it settled something in her. Money mattered, of course it did, but she'd spent 2 years building a life where she made decisions for herself, free from anyone else's influence, and she wasn't about to let a number on a paycheck rush her into something she hadn't fully thought through. She decided to take her time. No immediate yes, no immediate no. She'd let the offers sit for a few days, while she figured out what she actually wanted. Back at Calder's table, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably since Celeste's review began. Staff members who used to whisper complaints in the back hallway started speaking more openly, sensing that someone was finally listening. Noah found himself pulled into several conversations with Celeste over those days, asked directly about things he'd noticed over the past year, but never felt comfortable reporting. He didn't hold back. "Gavin plays favorites with the schedule," Noah told her during one of their meetings. "People who push back on anything end up with the worst shifts for weeks afterward. It's not always obvious, but it's consistent." He told her about Maren covering for Patrick without complaint, about the comment regarding the bus that had embarrassed her in front of a packed dining room, about smaller moments he'd witnessed over the months that had quietly chipped away at morale. He wasn't trying to get anyone fired out of spite. He just finally had someone willing to listen, and he gave her the full picture as honestly as he could. Celeste appreciated the honesty more than Noah realized. It confirmed what she'd already started piecing together from the records and feedback cards, but hearing it directly from someone who worked the floor every day gave her a clearer sense of how deep the problem ran. "Why didn't anyone come to me sooner?" she asked. Noah hesitated before answering. Because Gavin made it pretty clear that complaining about him would just make things harder. People were scared of losing shifts, or worse. That answer stayed with Celeste longer than anything else she'd heard that week. A restaurant should never run on fear, not from its own staff. She thought about all the years she'd spent building Calder's Table into something respected in the neighborhood, and how little of that reputation would matter if the people working there didn't feel safe doing their jobs. By midweek, without making any formal announcement yet, small changes had already begun. Schedules started being posted further in advance, double-checked for accuracy. Gavin's presence on the floor became noticeably reduced, though no one said exactly why. Staff members who'd kept their heads down for months started talking to each other more openly, sensing that something was about to change for the better, even if nobody knew the details yet. Maren noticed the shift too, though she said little about it. She kept working her shifts as usual, professional and steady, even as the ground beneath the restaurant quietly rearranged itself around her. Celeste called a private meeting with Gavin on Thursday morning before the restaurant opened for the day. She kept it simple and direct, laying out what her review had found: the pattern of favoritism in scheduling, the complaints from former employees who'd left without ever feeling comfortable explaining why, the public humiliation he'd put both Maren and a paying customer through in front of a full dining room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I've decided to remove you from the management position," she told him. "Effective today." Gavin tried to argue at first, pointing to years of service, to numbers he'd helped improve, to the simple fact that the restaurant had never lost money under his watch. Celeste listened patiently, then reminded him that running a successful business and running a fair one weren't always the same thing, and she could no longer pretend otherwise. "You're a hard worker," she said, "but the way you've treated people here isn't something I can keep allowing, no matter what the numbers say." He left without much more to say, the fight already gone out of him after the embarrassment of the past week. Celeste didn't waste time deciding who should take over. She'd watched Noah carefully over the past several days, the way he handled stress without raising his voice, the way staff naturally gravitated toward him when something went wrong. He hadn't asked for the position, hadn't lobbied for it the way some people might have, but his honesty during the review had told her everything she needed to know about how he'd lead. She offered him the manager role that same afternoon. Noah hesitated only briefly before accepting, mostly out of surprise rather than doubt. "I just want this place to feel different," he told her. "Not just for me, for everyone." Word spread quickly once the change became official, and within days, something noticeable started happening. Former employees who'd left under Gavin's management began reaching out, asking if positions were available again. A server named Iris, who'd quit nearly 8 months earlier after one too many public corrections from Gavin, came back in for an interview with Noah and was rehired by the end of the week. 2 others followed shortly after. The grand reopening event, organized quickly by Celeste as a way to mark the fresh start, brought in more people than the restaurant had seen on a single night in years. String lights were hung along the patio, a small jazz trio played near the entrance, and the kitchen put out a menu of small plates meant to showcase everything the restaurant did well. Regulars came out in support, along with new customers who'd heard about the changes through word of mouth. Celeste pulled Maren aside early in the evening, before the crowd had fully arrived. "I'd like to offer you the operations manager position," she said. "You've got the respect of everyone on this staff, customers included, and frankly, you understand what this place needs better than I do most days." Maren felt the weight of the offer settle over her, equal parts flattering and overwhelming. It was the kind of opportunity she'd quietly hoped for without ever expecting it to actually arrive. Still, she didn't answer right away. "Can I take a few days to think it over?" she asked. "I want to make sure I'm saying yes for the right reasons, not just because of everything that's happened recently." Celeste nodded, clearly expecting nothing less from her. Take all the time you need. Damon arrived later that evening, slipping into the reopening event without any of the attention that had followed him during his last visit. He wore a simple button-down shirt, nothing that drew eyes, and made his way through the patio crowd without anyone giving him a second glance. This time, nobody whispered his name across the room. He wasn't there as anyone important. He was there as Marin's husband, nothing more, nothing less, exactly the way he preferred it. He found her near the bar, finishing up a conversation with Iris, who'd just been rehired and was practically glowing with relief at being back. When Marin spotted him, she excused herself and walked over, slipping her hand into his. "You came," she said.
"Of course I came. This matters to you." They stood together near the edge of the patio, watching the string lights flicker against the evening sky, listening to the soft hum of the jazz trio, mixing with the conversation and laughter filling the space. A few co-workers glanced their way occasionally, but there was none of the tension or curiosity that had followed Damon's last visit. He was simply there, standing beside his wife, sharing a quiet moment in the middle of a celebration that neither of them had expected to be part of just a week earlier. For the first time, the people around them saw exactly what Marin had always wanted them to see, not a powerful man and the woman attached to his name, but two people who genuinely supported each other, standing quietly together in a crowd that had finally learned to see her for who she truly was. Marin took 4 days to think it over, the way she'd promised Celeste she would. She talked it through with Damon more than once, turning the offer over from every angle, weighing what it would mean to step into a role with that much responsibility at a restaurant that had only just started healing from months of mismanagement. By the end of the week, she had her answer. She met with Celeste in the same back office where Gavin had once sat with his head in his hands, except this time, the conversation carried none of that heaviness. "I'll take the position," Marin said, "but I want one condition attached to it." Celeste leaned forward, listening. "Every employee here gets evaluated by their work and their character, not by how they look, not by what kind of car they drive, or how they get to work. I want that written into how we train people, how we hire, how we handle complaints. I don't want what happened to me, or to anyone else here, to happen again, because someone decided they already knew a person's worth before giving them a chance to show it." Celeste didn't hesitate. "Done. I should have built that into this place a long time ago." Over the following weeks, Celeste worked with Marin and Noah to put together a new training program for the staff, one that focused as much on respect and professionalism as it did on service standards. New hires went through it during their first week. Existing staff sat through refresher sessions, led mostly by Marin herself, who found she had a natural way of explaining things without making anyone feel small in the process. The opposite of everything Gavin had ever modeled for them. The restaurant didn't transform overnight, but the difference showed up in small, steady ways. Staff turnover slowed. Customer reviews mentioned the warmth of the service more often than before. Patrick, the server whose shift Marin had once covered without a second thought, ended up training under her directly, soaking up the same patience she'd shown him months earlier. 2 weeks after the day Gavin had first humiliated her in front of a packed dining room, Marin found herself walking along the Chicago Riverwalk with Damon in the early evening, the water catching the last orange light of the day. They hadn't planned anything elaborate, just a walk, the kind they used to take in the early months of their marriage, before work and schedules had gotten in the way. "Feels strange," Marin said, watching a boat glide past under one of the bridges. 2 weeks ago I thought I might lose my job over a scheduling mix-up. Now I'm running the place." "You didn't lose anything," Damon said. "You just finally got put somewhere that matches what you've always been capable of." She laced her fingers through his, quiet for a moment, letting the sound of the water and the distant hum of the city settle around them. "I keep thinking about what you said, that first day you came in with the flowers, about not wanting people to know who you were because of me." "I remember." "I think I understand it differently now. It was never really about hiding you. It was about making sure that whatever respect I earned it as myself,
not as anyone's wife, just me. Damon stopped walking and turned to face her, the city lights starting to flicker on behind him as the sky deepened into evening. You did earn it. Every bit of it. I didn't do any of that for you. You did. They stood there a while longer before heading back toward Calder's table for the dinner reservation they'd made earlier in the week, this time with no surprises waiting, no tension simmering beneath the surface. When they walked through the door, Noah greeted them warmly from behind the host stand, leading them to a table near the window, without any of the awkwardness that had marked Damon's last visit. Staff members who passed their table throughout the evening smiled and said hello, not with the nervous deference people sometimes showed toward someone influential, but with the easy familiarity of people who'd come to know Marin over months of working alongside her. They weren't impressed by Damon's name or his reputation.
They were glad to see Marin happy, surrounded by someone who clearly cared about her, finishing a meal in the restaurant where she'd built something real out of nothing but consistency and quiet integrity. Near the end of dinner, as the candle between them burned low and the restaurant settled into its evening rhythm, Damon reached across the table and took her hand. "You know," he said, "your greatest achievement was never proving who your husband was. It was proving exactly who you were, all on your own." Marin smiled, something settled and certain in her expression, the kind of peace that came from finally being seen for exactly who she'd always been. Outside, the Chicago skyline lit up against the darkening sky, indifferent to the quiet victory that had unfolded inside one small restaurant. A victory that had nothing to do with power or wealth, and everything to do with the simple, steady truth of a woman who'd never needed anyone else's name to prove what she'd known about herself all along.